A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Macaulay. A new episode every single day. Episode 20, Geometry of Sacrificial Flesh. The morning after the immolation, Igi was strangled by a sticky, leaden fog that tasted of cold ash and weeping earth. Behind the cluster of royal pavilions, the great necropolis loomed, a silent, blackened mountain harboring the charnel remains of the late king. Its rising heat distorted the gray horizon, shimmering like a fever dream. From the distance, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of shipwrights and carpenters, hastily framing the spectator, stands echoed off the tomb cliffs, sounding less like construction and more like the rapid assembly of a massive gallows. The regent, Ptolemy of Elorus, moved with a frantic urgency, desperate to jolt the kingdom out of its paralysis of mourning. He meant to drag Macedon directly into the cold, clanking machinery of his new domestic order. In the staging area, away from the prying eyes of the court, the three pillars of the Macedonian military converged. They were not mourning a king. They were preparing for the survival of a state. Old Italus, the grim guardian, stood like a statue of weathered basalt, his hand locked onto the pommel of his massive longsword. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the pyre still smoldered. The boy king invited the wolves to dinner, and now he is shocked they have teeth, Italus rumbled, his voice a low, gravel-strewn growl. Parmenion and Antipater shield the princes. The line must hold, even if the king is already a corpse. This game will show who is left to inherit the carnage. Parmenion, the silent arbiter, did not glance toward the royal quarters. His face was a mask of cold, utilitarian indifference. The king was an idiot. But the throne is a necessity. Antipater, secure the boy Philip for the games. If the king is dead in all but name, the kingdom is not. The tragedy is that the men who deserve to lead are currently the ones holding the daggers. Antipater, the architect of ruin, stood slightly apart, his eyes mapping the shifting loyalties of the commanders and the nervous energy of the foreign envoys. He was analytical, calculating. To him, the coming chaos was merely an equation to be solved. "The king is gone," he murmured, his voice as precise as a scribe's needle. "I can already smell the rot." Parmenion, hold the line. I will handle the political narrative during these games. We don't save the king, we save the idea of a kingdom. And there is only one way to ensure that the next king must be someone we can mold. Standing at the periphery, young Italus watched the scene with a bitter, hollow gaze. He didn't look at the generals with respect. He looked at them with a searing, youthful contempt. "Look at them," he whispered to the dark. "All these great men, fighting over a throne that was never ours to begin with. The king wanted to be a hero. He will be nothing but a footnote in a blood-stained ledger." He tightened his grip on his belt, his knuckles white. "I'm done waiting for a hero. If the games are to decide the future, then tonight I start being the butcher." High above the tomb-strewn city, on a sheltered terrace, Ismenias of Thebes watched the rising sun. His white cloak bore the dark, jagged smudges of the previous night's fire. Behind him, the Theban vanguard waited in statuesque silence. "The Illyrians have done us a service," Ismenias said, his voice a low, calculated rasp. "They have stripped away the veneer of Argead authority. The palace is a shell. The court is in panic." He turned to his lieutenant, whose hand never strayed from his xiphus. "Do we strike now? Before the games? We could turn this arena into a slaughterhouse, while they are distracted by their grief." The lieutenant bowed his head slightly. "The gates are clogged with nervous lords, custodian. If we trigger the collapse now, we cannot control the flow of the bodies. The Lyncestians expect an opening. If we move prematurely, we inherit a city in flames, not a client state." Ismenias drummed his fingers against the stone balustrade. "You speak of control. But Macedonia is a beast that only knows the lash." He looked toward the center of Igi, where the funeral pyre sent a sluggish column of gray smoke into the sky. "Very well. We let the games commence. We let them believe they are burying their dead. We let the boy Philip step into the ring and play his part in this hollow farce." His eyes hardened. "But mark me, once the first blood hits the sand, the games are no longer a ritual. We do not need to ambush them in the dark anymore. We shall dismantle them while they watch, in the light of day. By the time the final funeral torch is extinguished, Thebes will be the only power left standing in Macedon." On a jagged ridge overlooking the amphitheater, The scout for Bartolus, a man mapped by the scars of a dozen northern skirmishes, watched the crowd gather with the patience of a vulture. He remained a silhouette, unnoticed as a stone in the dirt. He had watched Pella turn into a furnace, a spectacle that had satisfied the hunger of his masters. Now he surveyed the sacred capital with a cold, narrow gaze. "The walls of Igi are ancient and weak," he murmured to the wind, his voice a dry rasp. "They are tombs masquerading as a city." He watched the nobility file into the stone tiers, preening in the shadow of their own extinction. Below them, the prince was being readied for the sand, a boy king in waiting being fed to a butcher. "We watched the palace burn last night," he continued, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. "Today, we watch the heirs destroy themselves. My master does not care who wears the crown, so long as the head beneath it is severed." He shifted his grip on his bow, locking onto the center of the ring. He was not there to cheer for a champion. He was there to count the survivors, waiting for the exact moment when the Argead house would be hollowed out enough for the Illyrian storm to finally break over the gates. On a jagged ridge overlooking the amphitheater, the true masters of the carnage sat in grim, silent observation. Bartolus, the Illyrian juggernaut, sat cross-legged upon a flat stone, his massive frame swathed in furs and blackened iron. Beside him, his family watched, a pack of wolves in human skin. His daughter, Audata, stood with a hand resting habitually on the hilt of her hunting blade, her eyes scanning the stadium with the clinical intensity of a hawk. Beside her stood his son, Cletus, a man of brutal strength and calculated ambition, and at his feet sat Cletus's own boy, Bartolus II, a child already hardened by the shadow of his grandfather's weapons, watching the arena with chilling, unblinking intent. They had watched Pella turn into a furnace the night before, a spectacle that had satisfied the hunger of their clan. Now they surveyed the sacred capital with a cold, predatory patience. Bartolus traced the path of the city's walls with a heavy, calloused finger. "The walls of Igi are ancient and weak," he murmured, his voice a low, grinding sound like shifting tectonic plates. "They are tombs masquerading as a city." Audata leaned forward, her gaze cutting toward the royal box. "They preen in their finery, father, acting as if the crown still holds weight. See the boy prince? They feed him to the butcher to keep their own hands clean." Cletus looked down at his own son, Bartolus II, who mirrored the hunger in his father's eyes. "Let them watch the heirs destroy themselves," Cletus muttered. "It saves us the labor of a siege." Bartolus shifted his weight, his eyes locking onto the center of the ring where the prince was being readied for the sand. "We watched the palace burn. Today, we watch the dynasty hollow itself out. I do not care who wears the crown, so long as the head beneath it is severed." He turned to his scouts, his face darkening like an oncoming storm. "Wait for the boy to strike. When the confusion hits its peak, we do not cheer. We descend." Are you looking to expand this scene further, perhaps focusing on the initial clash between Philip and Logos, or would you like to move directly into the chaos as the Theban and Illyrian agendas collide? The morning after the immolation, Igi was strangled by a sticky, leaden fog that tasted of cold ash and weeping earth. Behind the cluster of royal pavilions, the great necropolis loomed, a silent, blackened mountain harboring the charnel remains of the late king. Its rising heat distorted the gray horizon, shimmering like a fever dream. To the nobility, these funeral games were a Homeric echo, a solemn ritual to appease the unquiet ghosts of the Argead ancestors. But beneath the veneer of tradition lay a more lethal purpose. In the brutal reality of the Macedonian court, physical prowess was the ultimate signifier of divine right. Philip, the youngest son and periphery prince, was an inconvenient artifact of a house being stripped for parts. To the men who held the daggers, the arena was a filter. A trial by fire where the prince would either prove he possessed the aristia, the supreme excellence of a warrior, or be erased by the gravity of the ring. In the training yard was a scar upon the earth, a patch of churned mud where the smell of blood was already becoming familiar. Young Attalus stood before the regent, his posture loose but his eyes sharp, vibrating with a cold, aristocratic disdain. Beside him stood Logos. He was a mercenary veteran from the Thracian borderlands, though he wore the deceptive, taut physique of a younger man. He possessed double the mass of an average soldier, his thick, callous knuckles already having fractured the skulls of grown men in the brutal border skirmishes. He was a monolith of corded muscle, a fighter who did not breathe so much as he waited to break things. Attalus gestured to the beast with a careless flick of his hand. He's not a man of subtle tactics, Regent. He's a blunt instrument. And for the games, I find that a blunt instrument is the only thing that holds any truth. The Regent eyed the fighter, aware of the promise he had whispered to the brood in the dark. If you splinter the prince's ribs and leave him permanently crippled before the assembled eyes of the army, a captaincy in my own Aloros elite guard shall be yours. The Regent fixed his gaze on Attalus. You seek to put a hound of this size against the last son of Amyntas. The court will call it a slaughter, not a sport. Attalus let out a dry, jagged laugh that held no mirth. The court calls everything a slaughter these days, Regent. They whisper of poison in the wine and shadows in the halls. Let them call this a slaughter, at least in the ring, the violence is honest. It doesn't hide behind a curtain or a cup of wine. Let them whisper, Attalus thought, his gaze hardening as he looked toward the palace, where Philip would soon appear. They think I'm playing a game of simple cruelty, but they are blind. If the boy dies, he was never fit for the burden of a name that requires blood to keep. If he survives, he learns the only lesson that matters. The world is a grinder, and we are all just grist. Besides, Attalus continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate register, why protect him from Logos? He is an Argead. He cannot stand beneath the weight of a true predator. How will he ever stand beneath the weight of a crown? You worry about the optics of his death, Regent. I worry about the reality of his weakness. The Regent thinks he's calculating the risks of my ambition, Attalus mused, his lips curling into a thin, shark-like smile. He thinks I'm just a tool for his own ends, an instrument to purge the surplus heirs so his hands remain clean for Perdiccas. He's half right. I will be the butcher, but the boy will be the whetstone. I need to know if the last of this line is made of steel, or if he's just another golden trinket waiting to be stolen. He's the champion for the games, then? The Regent asked, his voice tight. Attalus took a step closer, his presence commanding the space between them. He is the necessity. If you truly wish for a successor who can navigate the serpent's nest of Thebes, you do not coddle him with training swords and courtly sparring. You feed him to the wolf. If he dies, it was a tragedy. If he survives, you finally have a king worth the throne. He turned his attention back to Logos, his voice dropping to a low, hissed command that the Regent wasn't meant to hear. Break his spirit if you can, beast. But if he refuses to break, then show me the color of his resolve. I want to see if the blood in his veins is as cold as he pretends it to be. Inside the pavilion of Queen Mother Eurydice, the flickering amber glow of a solitary oil lamp cast elongated, grotesque silhouettes against the heavy-hide walls. The air was stifling, thick with the unwashed scent of morning grease, and the sharp medicinal tang of crushed mint used to mask the smell of sweat. In the dim chamber, Perdiccas, the freshly titled king, and his sister, Princess Eurydice, pressed against one another as if to extract warmth from their mutual terror. Perdiccas was visibly trembling, his skin a translucent, sickly white. He was to be paraded before the border barons as nothing more than Ptolemy's painted, mechanical doll. His eyes held the vacant, shattered look of a man stepping onto a scaffold. Am a ghost with a crown, Perdiccas thought, his teeth clicking softly. If I say the wrong word to the barons today, Ptolemy's mercenaries will ensure I join Alexander before the moon turns. Eurydice, however, clamped her fingers around her brother's shaking hand with freezing, unyielding pressure. Her gaze held no despair. It was driven by a savage, clinical obsession with survival. She looked upon her youngest brother, Philip, not with pity, but as a general looks upon a final, desperate counterwager, a hostage being systematically prepared for a lethal transition. At the center of the pavilion, Eurydice stood over Philip. Her face, hollowed by a sleepless vigil, had hardened into a mask of terminal malice. She was personally adjusting the heavy leather wrappings for his match in the youth pancration. Her fingers worked with a violent, bone-pinching force as she tightened his sandals, converting mundane athletic preparation into a grim, sacrificial ritual. Ptolemy and young Attalus have selected their own prize fighter for your final match, Philip, Eurydice whispered, her tone shearing away in the draft whistling through the tent seams. A brute named Logos, a mercenary veteran from the Thracian borderlands masquerading as a youth. He possesses double your mass, and his knuckles have already fractured the skulls of grown men in the border skirmishes. If he splinters your ribs and leaves you permanently crippled before the assembled eyes of the army, Ptolemy has promised him a captaincy in the Aloros elite guard. Perdiccas caught his breath, his hand slipping against the sweat-slicked hilt of his ceremonial sword. Ptolemy's calculus was flawless. Keep the new king weak in Pella, while publicly crushing the only other prince capable of rallying the northern clans. Eurydice ignored her elder children's panic. She withdrew a small, dense weight from her robes, wrapped in stained silk. She unfurled it to reveal a heavy signet ring, bearing the striking, predatory silhouette of the Lion of Cadmea, the sovereign seal of Thebes. She forced the cold bronze into Philip's palm, her fingers crushing his hand until the metal bit deep. "This belonged to an officer of the Theban vanguard," she breathed. "They are watching us, monitoring the depth of Macedonia's wounds like vultures. General Pelopidas is marching from the south, but his scouts are already inside this camp. They are not hunting for a victim to rescue. They are scanning for a casus belli, a mathematical reason to intervene." Philip looked down at the dark weight in his hand, his youthful face showing an eerie lack of emotion. "You expect me to use this to signal the Thebans?" "I expect you to survive so you have the time to sharpen your own claws," Eurydice hissed, seizing him by the jaw to force his face into the lamp glow. "Ptolemy wants the phalanx to see you as a fragile, broken Argead boy, pitted, dismissed, and forgotten. But those watchers in the dark are reporting your every reaction back to Pelopidas. Your instructions are absolute. Lose the match on the sand, but capture the Theban general through strategy. If necessary, flash that ring. If Pelopidas arrives to find a prince who is already a student of his own tactical geometry, he will demand you as the supreme political hostage before Ptolemy can finish your execution." Princess Eurydice stepped forward, her voice a chilling, precise command. "Go, Philip. Perdiccas and I will remain inside the iron cage of Pella. But if you leap into the throat of the southern hegemon, the purest half of our dynasty's bloodline moves beyond the regent's reach. Our fire will be preserved in the south." Philip closed his fist over the ring. The sharp, raised bronze of the Theban lion drew a tiny, hot bead of crimson that mixed with the dust on his skin. He understood the architecture of the gamble. To the soldiers in the stands, he would appear a tragic, vanquished prince. But to the silent Greeks watching from the ink of the tree line, he would reveal himself as a strategist who knew exactly when to endure in order to conquer. "Logos will be trying to kill me, Mother," Philip said, his pupils contracting into points of hardened bronze. "He is not seeking an athletic victory. He is seeking a continuation of the funeral. Then ensure the vanguard sees his murderous intent and let them witness the unyielding architecture of your bones," Eurydice replied. "Let him break your skin, but never your alignment. You will become the heavy Argead hammer that will one day shatter Ptolemy's world." Brune. The piercing blast of a bull's horn trumpet shattered the morning silence, the signal to the arena. Philip did not look back. He slipped the ring into the secret fold of his loincloth, thrust aside the heavy hide flap, and stepped into the cold gray glare of the morning. His eyes locked straight ahead, focusing on the blood-red clay of the stadium tracks in Igi. The air in the ancient capital was sharp, tainted by the smoke of pyres that refused to die. These funeral games were a ritualized evisceration of the old order. The preceding night of fire had left the city a jagged mosaic of terror, and now the survivors had gathered to perform the rites. To the nobility, it was a Homeric echo, to the masses, a display of power. But to the men watching from the stone tiers, the arena was a theater of mediated war where rival factions tested their blades. The arena of Igi was a bowl of calcified silence, the morning fog caught in the stone tiers like a held breath. Philip stepped onto the churned clay, his small frame dwarfed by the sheer, hulking presence of Logos, who stood opposite him like a mountain of scarred, animate meat. High above, in the shadow of the royal dais, old Italus, the grim guardian, stood motionless. His hand was fused to the pommel of his massive longsword, the leather wrapping of the hilt creaking under a grip that could snap a man's spine. His eyes, rimmed with the exhaustion of a man who had not slept since the palace fire, were fixed entirely on the prince. He watched the boy move, noting the way Philip tested the ground, the way he held his weight, the terrifying, predatory stillness that had begun to settle over his features. "The boy has the eyes of a wolf," Italus rumbled, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely rose above the rustle of the surrounding soldiers. "But he is fighting a bear. He turned his head just enough to catch the gaze of the nearby courtiers, the sycophants who had arranged this slaughter for the regent's comfort. His stare was saturated with a violent homicidal intent that made the men around him recoil. "If he dies," Attalus continued, his tone dropping into a dangerous razor-edged whisper, "I will take the head of every man who set this match. Let them remember that the line holds, even if I have to paint this sand with the blood of the tutors who whispered these traps into their ears." Beside him, Parmenion did not blink, his attention fixed on the ring, but Antipater shifted slightly, sensing the tectonic shift in the old soldier's temper. The air in the royal box grew frigid. Attalus was no longer just guarding a prince, he was a coiled spring, and the entire court was now standing within his reach. Parmenion, the silent arbiter, remained a fixture of unyielding granite. He did not mirror the grim guardian's rage. He watched the boy with the cold, detached appraisal of a stonemason examining a foundation block for structural weakness. "The boy is a test," Parmenion said, his voice like stones grinding deep beneath the earth. "If he falls, Macedonia deserves to burn under the Illyrians. We are a kingdom of iron, not glass. If we cannot produce a leader who can survive a beast of the borderlands, we are already forfeit. If he stands, then perhaps there is a future worth defending. Either way, he is the only variable that matters." Antipater, the architect of ruin, stood slightly behind them, his gaze cold, flat, and entirely unburdened by sentiment. While Attalus prepared to kill and Parmenion prepared to judge, Antipater was already living in the aftermath. He traced the lines of the arena as if they were the borders of a map he had already conquered. "If the prince dies, the regency is finalized, the transition will be bloodless, if not clean," Antipater murmured, his tone as precise as a scribe's needle. "If he lives, he becomes a symbol. The masses love a survivor, and symbols are far harder to dismantle than princes." He shifted his weight, his fingers twitching in the folds of his robes, touching the seal of a scroll tucked into his belt. "I have already drafted the decree for either outcome," he added, a thin, shadow-like smile touching his lips. "Politics is the art of turning a tragedy into an asset. Whether he bleeds out in that dirt or walks away with his life, the structure of the state will remain exactly as I have designed it." Young Attalus remained on the periphery of the royal box, his presence a jagged dissonance. He stood slightly apart, his knuckles wide as his hand locked around the hilt of his sword, his gaze flickering between the hulking, blood-hungry form of Logos and the slender, pale figure of Philip. "Look at them," he whispered to the wind, his voice sharp with poisonous youthful disillusionment. "All these great men watching a child fight a butcher. The king wanted to be a hero. He will be nothing but a footnote in a blood-stained ledger. The boy? He is being forced to be a beast carved out of his own innocence by their tradition." He felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the court's hypocrisy pressing in on him, a theater of vultures pretending to be mourners. He drew his blade an inch from its scabbard, a whisper of steel that sounded like a promise of violence. "Am the only one who knows the truth," he murmured, his voice hardening into something cold and terminal. "The games aren't to honor the dead. They are to see who is fit to feast on the scraps of what's left of us." He looked back at the ring, his gaze finally resting on Philip, who stood motionless, a sliver of defiance in the vast, blood-slicked center of the arena. Attalus's jaw tightened, his expression shifting from bitterness to a dark, singular resolve. "Tonight, I stop watching. Tonight, I become the butcher." At the center stood Philip. The lowland lords watched from the royal box with clinical detachment, their faces still grimed with the soot of the night's failed coup. To them, Philip was a golden trinket, a fragile heir whose death would be a convenient accident. But for Philip, the games were his only way to speak. He looked across the churned, blood-slicked earth at Logos, a monolith of corded muscle, a butcher who had already fractured the skulls of grown men. Philip tightened his grip on his spear. The trap was laid, the observers were breathless, and the ancient spirits of Igi were waiting. He was not fighting for his father's ghost or his brother's throne. He was fighting because in a kingdom full of vipers, the only way to be heard was to become the thing that killed them. To be continued in episode 21, Game of Wills. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.